The morning fog hung thick over the naval base as Sarah Chun stepped off the transport bus, her single duffel bag slung over her shoulder. At 28, she looked younger than her years, with an unassuming presence that made her blend into any crowd. The other passengers hurried past her, eager to begin their first day at the prestigious Meridian Naval Command Center, but Sarah moved with deliberate calm, her dark eyes taking in every detail of her surroundings. The base buzzed with activity. Fresh recruits stumbled around with maps, trying to find their assigned buildings. Seasoned personnel moved with purpose, their uniforms crisp and bearing the marks of years of service. Sarah noticed the subtle hierarchies at play, how junior officers stepped aside for their superiors, how conversations quieted when someone of higher rank approached. She approached the main administration building, an imposing structure of gray concrete and steel that had stood for decades. Inside, fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the polished floors. Sarah joined the queue of new arrivals at the processing desk, where a harried-looking petty officer was checking names against a long list. Next, the petty officer called out without looking up. Sarah stepped forward. Sarah Chun, reporting for duty. The petty officer's eyes scanned the list, his finger tracing down the names. He found it and made a check mark. Administrative assistant, civilian contractor, Department of Naval Intelligence. He handed her a temporary ID badge and a folder of paperwork. Building C, 3rd floor. Report to Mrs. Rodriguez in HR. She'll get you sorted. Sarah accepted the materials with a polite nod. The temporary badge bore her photo and the words contractor, escort required in bold red letters. She clipped it to her plain white blouse and made her way through the maze of corridors toward Building C. The naval base was like a small city with its own rhythm and culture. Sarah passed cafeterias where officers grabbed quick coffee between meetings, training facilities where the sound of physical instruction echoed through open doors, and briefing rooms where classified discussions took place behind closed doors. Everything was efficient, orderly, and hierarchy-driven. Building C housed the administrative departments, and the atmosphere was more relaxed than the operational areas Sarah had passed. Civilian contractors mixed with military personnel, creating a blend of formal uniforms and business casual attire. Sarah found the HR department on the 3rd floor, where Mrs. Rodriguez, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, welcomed her warmly. "You must be Sarah Chun," Mrs. Rodriguez said, looking up from her computer. "We've been expecting you. How was your trip?" "Smooth, thank you," Sarah replied, settling into the chair across from Mrs. Rodriguez's desk. "Perfect. Now, let's get you oriented. You'll be working in the Intelligence Analysis Division as an administrative assistant. Your supervisor is Commander Williams. He's running a bit behind schedule today, but he'll meet with you this afternoon. In the meantime, let me show you around and get you familiar with our procedures." For the next hour, Mrs. Rodriguez walked Sarah through the basics, where to find supplies, how to access the computer systems, the protocol for handling classified materials, and the general flow of daily operations. Sarah listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions that demonstrated her attention to detail. "You seem very prepared," Mrs. Rodriguez observed as they concluded the orientation. "Your background check came back spotless, and your references were glowing. What did you work before this?" "Various administrative roles," Sarah said with a modest smile. "I've always enjoyed supporting teams and helping organizations run smoothly." Mrs. Rodriguez led Sarah to her assigned workspace, a small desk in an open office area shared by several other administrative staff. The space was functional but pleasant, with large windows overlooking the base's central courtyard. Sarah's desk came equipped with a computer, phone, and filing cabinets that would house the various reports and documents she'd be managing. "Sarah, meet your colleagues," Mrs. Rodriguez said, introducing her to the other staff members in the area. There was Janet, a longtime civilian employee who handled personnel files. Mike, a young man fresh out of college who managed logistics coordination, and Patricia, a former military spouse who specialized in communication support. The group welcomed Sarah warmly, immediately including her in their morning coffee routine and offering to help her settle in. Sarah appreciated their friendliness while maintaining the reserved demeanor of someone still learning the ropes. Around noon, Commander Williams finally appeared. He was a tall man in his 40s with prematurely gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His uniform was perfectly pressed, and his manner was brisk but not unkind. "Ms. Chun, I presume," he said, extending his hand. "Sorry for the delay. Crisis management never sleeps in this business." "No problem at all, Commander. I understand the demands of the job." "Good. Let's grab lunch in my office and discuss your role here." Commander Williams's office was larger than Sarah had expected, with walls lined with commendations, maps, and photographs from various naval operations. His desk was organized chaos, stacks of reports, multiple computer monitors, and a secure phone that seemed to ring constantly. "Here's the situation," Commander Williams said, unwrapping a sandwich as he spoke. "We're drowning in data analysis requests. Everything from routine intelligence assessments to urgent operational planning. I need someone who can help organize the workflow, coordinate between departments, and ensure nothing falls through the cracks." Sarah nodded, making notes in a small notebook. "What's the typical volume and priority system?" "High volume, shifting priorities," Williams replied with a rueful laugh. "What's urgent at 8 in the morning might be irrelevant by noon, and what seems routine might suddenly become critical. That's why I need someone with good instincts and the ability to think on their feet." "I'm comfortable with dynamic environments," Sarah said. "In previous positions, I've found that maintaining clear communication channels and flexible systems helps manage changing priorities." "Exactly what I want to hear. Your first task will be reviewing our current filing system and suggesting improvements. We're still using protocols that were designed for a much smaller operation." For the remainder of the afternoon, Sarah familiarized herself with the department's operations. She reviewed files, observed the workflow, and began to understand the complex web of relationships between different naval units, intelligence agencies, and administrative departments. The work was genuinely challenging. Each report that crossed her desk dealt with sensitive information. Everything from equipment assessments to personnel evaluations to strategic planning documents. Sarah handled each piece of information with appropriate care, but her colleagues noticed she seemed remarkably comfortable with military terminology and procedures for someone with a purely civilian background. "You catch on quick," Janet observed as they prepared to leave for the day. "Most new people take weeks to understand our systems." "I'm a fast learner," Sarah replied, shutting down her computer and organizing her desk. "Plus, everyone here has been very helpful." As the day wound down, Sarah walked through the base toward the temporary housing where she'd be staying until she found permanent accommodations. The evening brought a different energy to the facility. Day shift personnel heading home while night shift crews took over critical operations. She passed the officers' club, where she could hear the sound of conversation and laughter from military personnel unwinding after their duties. Through the windows, she saw groups clustered around tables, discussing everything from family updates to professional challenges. It was a close-knit community built on shared purpose and mutual respect. Sarah's temporary quarters were modest but comfortable, a small apartment with basic furnishings and everything she needed for her stay. As she unpacked her few belongings, she reflected on her first day. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Her cover was solid, her colleagues were welcoming, and she had access to exactly the information she needed. But as Sarah hung up her civilian clothes and prepared for her second day, she was already thinking several steps ahead. Her real mission was just beginning, and it would require all of her skills to maintain her carefully constructed identity while gathering the intelligence she'd been sent to collect. The next morning brought new challenges. Sarah arrived early, as was her habit, and found Commander Williams already at his desk, looking frazzled. "Ms. Chun, perfect timing," he said without looking up from his computer. "We just received a priority request from Fleet Command. They need a comprehensive analysis of our readiness levels across 3 different scenarios, and they need it by end of week." "What kind of support do you need?" Sarah asked, already pulling out her notebook. "Coordination, mainly. This will require input from at least 6 different departments, each with their own priorities and timelines. Someone needs to ride herd on the whole process and make sure we deliver a coherent product." Sarah spent the morning mapping out the requirements, identifying key personnel, and establishing a coordination schedule. Her natural organizational skills impressed everyone she worked with, but it was her understanding of military operations that began to draw attention. During a planning meeting with department heads from various units, Sarah offered several suggestions that demonstrated a sophisticated grasp of naval strategy. When Lieutenant Commander Jackson mentioned concerns about logistics coordination, Sarah immediately understood the implications for operational readiness. When Captain Morrison discussed intelligence requirements, Sarah asked follow-up questions that showed she understood both the collection and analysis sides of the process. "Where did you say you worked before coming here?" Captain Morrison asked during a break in the meeting. "Various administrative roles," Sarah replied with the same modest smile she'd used before. "I've always found military operations fascinating, so I do a lot of reading in my spare time." Captain Morrison nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation, but Sarah noticed he continued to observe her throughout the rest of the meeting. The week progressed smoothly, with Sarah proving herself increasingly valuable to the Intelligence Analysis Division. She streamlined reporting procedures, improved coordination between departments, and demonstrated an uncanny ability to anticipate problems before they became critical. But it was her response to an unexpected crisis that truly caught everyone's attention. On Thursday afternoon, alarms suddenly blared throughout the base. It wasn't a drill. A genuine emergency had developed. Sarah was in Commander Williams's office when the alert came through, and she watched him spring into action, coordinating with various units to understand the situation. "Security breach in Building A," Williams announced, hanging up his secure phone. "Someone accessed classified files without proper authorization. We need to lock down all data access and conduct a full investigation." The next few hours were chaotic. Personnel from multiple departments worked to secure sensitive information while investigators tried to determine the scope of the breach. Sarah found herself in the middle of the response, helping to coordinate between security personnel, IT specialists, and administrative staff. As the crisis unfolded, Sarah's colleagues began to notice something unusual about her behavior. While everyone else was scrambling to understand protocols and procedures, Sarah moved with calm confidence, seeming to instinctively know what needed to be done and in what order. When a young ensign panicked about potentially compromised communication channels, Sarah quickly explained the backup procedures. When civilian contractors worried about their access levels being revoked, Sarah helped them understand the temporary security measures. When senior officers needed status updates, Sarah had the information organized and ready. "She's handling this like she's been through security incidents before," Janet whispered to Mike as they watched Sarah efficiently manage a dozen different tasks. "Yeah, and did you notice she knew about the backup communication protocols before anyone explained them?" Mike replied, "That's pretty advanced stuff for an administrative assistant." By evening, the crisis was resolved. The security breach turned out to be the result of a clerical error rather than malicious intent, but the response had been swift and comprehensive. As the base returned to normal operations, Commander Williams pulled Sarah aside. "Outstanding work today," he said. "Your coordination efforts probably saved us several hours of confusion. I'm putting a commendation in your file." "Just doing my job, Commander," Sarah replied, but she could see the thoughtful look in his eyes. That night, as Sarah returned to her temporary quarters, she knew her carefully maintained cover was beginning to show cracks. Her instinctive responses during the crisis had been too smooth, too professional, too knowledgeable for someone with only a civilian administrative background. She would need to be more careful. Her mission depended on maintaining her identity as a simple contractor, but her training and experience kept surfacing in moments of pressure. The balance between effectiveness and concealment was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. As she prepared for sleep, Sarah reviewed the intelligence she'd gathered so far. Her access to files and meetings had already provided valuable information about naval capabilities and strategic planning. But she was beginning to suspect that her true identity might be discovered sooner than anticipated. The question was whether she could complete her mission before someone connected all the dots and realized that the unassuming administrative assistant was something much more significant than she appeared to be. The weekend brought Sarah a brief respite from the growing scrutiny at the naval base. She spent Saturday exploring the nearby town, maintaining the routine of a new resident getting familiar with her surroundings. But even during her off hours, her mind remained focused on the delicate balance she was trying to maintain. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected development. As Sarah settled at her desk with her usual cup of coffee, she noticed Commander Williams speaking in hushed tones with Captain Morrison near the entrance to the intelligence division. Both men glanced in her direction several times during their conversation. "Sarah," Commander Williams called out, approaching her desk, "I need you to attend a briefing this morning. Admiral Richardson is visiting from Fleet Command, and he's requested a comprehensive overview of our current operations. I want you there to take notes and coordinate any follow-up actions." Sarah's pulse quickened slightly, but she maintained her composed exterior. Admiral Richardson was one of the most respected naval commanders in the fleet, known for his strategic brilliance and no-nonsense approach to operations. Meeting him while maintaining her cover would be a significant challenge. "Of course, Commander. What time and where?" "Conference room A0900 hours. Bring your notebook and be prepared for a long session." The Admiral asks detailed questions. At exactly 0900 hours, Sarah entered conference room, a sophisticated briefing space equipped with multiple screens, secure communication systems, and seating for about 20 people. Admiral Richardson commanded attention the moment she saw him. A distinguished man in his early 60s with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades making critical decisions under pressure. The room was filled with senior officers from various departments, each representing different aspects of the base's operations. Sarah took her assigned seat near the back, notebook ready, playing the role of the quiet administrative support staff member. Admiral Richardson began the briefing by outlining his concerns about regional security developments and the need for enhanced readiness across all naval facilities. As he spoke, Sarah found herself analyzing not just his words, but his strategic thinking, the way he prioritized different threats, and his assessment of current capabilities. "Commander Williams," Admiral Richardson said, turning his attention to Sarah's supervisor, "your intelligence analysis has been particularly thorough. Walk me through your assessment of the emerging threats in the South Pacific." Commander Williams launched into a detailed presentation, covering everything from submarine movements to communications intercepts. Sarah took careful notes, but she also found herself mentally critiquing the analysis, identifying gaps and alternative interpretations that weren't being discussed. During a brief break, Admiral Richardson circulated through the room, speaking informally with various officers. Sarah was surprised when he approached her desk. "You must be new here," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command, but with a hint of curiosity. "Yes, Admiral. Sarah Chun, administrative support for the intelligence division. And what's your assessment of our operations here?" The question caught Sarah off guard. It was unusual for a senior admiral to ask a civilian contractor for operational opinions. She had to be careful not to reveal too much knowledge while still providing a thoughtful response. "From an administrative perspective, the coordination between departments is impressive," she said carefully. "The information flow seems efficient, though there might be opportunities to streamline some reporting procedures." Admiral Richardson nodded thoughtfully. "Efficiency is critical in intelligence work. What specific improvements would you suggest?" Sarah found herself walking a tightrope. Her instincts told her exactly what changes would enhance the operation, but revealing that level of insight would raise questions about her background. Perhaps consolidating some of the duplicate reporting requirements, she suggested. I've noticed some information gets processed through multiple channels when a single, more comprehensive report might be more useful. Interesting observation. You've been here, 2 weeks? Just over a week, Admiral. And you've already identified redundancies in our reporting structure. Admiral Richardson's eyes studied Sarah with the intensity of someone accustomed to reading people quickly and accurately. That shows good analytical instincts. Before Sarah could respond, Commander Williams called for the briefing to resume. But she noticed Admiral Richardson continued to glance in her direction throughout the remainder of the session. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Sarah's desk. Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Foster from Naval Criminal Investigative Service approached with a friendly smile, but Sarah immediately recognized the purposeful way she moved. Miss Chun, I am Rebecca Foster, Chief. Do you have a few minutes to chat? Sarah's training kicked in, but she forced herself to appear curious rather than concerned. Of course. Is there a problem? Nothing serious. Just routine follow-up on last week's security incident. I'm speaking with everyone who had access to the affected systems. They moved to a small conference room where Lieutenant Commander Foster opened a tablet and began asking questions about Sarah's activities during the security breach. The questions seemed routine at first. Where was she when the alarm sounded? What files had she accessed? Did she notice anything unusual? But gradually the questions became more pointed. You handled the crisis very smoothly, Foster observed. Have you dealt with security incidents before? Not exactly like that, Sarah replied carefully. But I've worked in environments where emergency procedures were important. You learn to stay calm and follow protocols. What kind of environments? Sarah had prepared for this question, but delivering her cover story to a trained investigator felt different than casual conversations with colleagues. Corporate settings, mainly. Places where data security and crisis management were priorities. Foster made notes on her tablet. Your personnel file mentions various administrative roles, but it's light on specific details. Can you tell me more about your previous employers? I've worked for several consulting firms over the years. The nature of the work often involved confidentiality agreements, so I can't discuss specific clients or projects in detail. It wasn't technically a lie, but Sarah knew that Foster was probably making mental notes about the vague responses. Good investigators had instincts about when people weren't being completely forthcoming. I understand about confidentiality, Foster said with a smile. One more question. During the crisis, you seemed very familiar with our backup communication protocols. What did you learn about those? This was a question Sarah had been dreading. Her knowledge of military procedures was extensive, but explaining how she knew about backup protocols without raising suspicion was nearly impossible. I read through the orientation materials very thoroughly, she said. Plus, during the crisis, people were explaining procedures as we went along. I have a good memory for that kind of detail. Foster nodded and closed her tablet. That covers everything I need. Thanks for your time. But as Foster left, Sarah knew the investigation was far from over. Her responses had been plausible, but not completely convincing, and Foster was clearly the type of investigator who followed up on inconsistencies. That evening, Sarah made a secure call from her apartment to her handler, a conversation that required multiple layers of encryption and careful timing. The cover is holding, but barely, she reported. I'm drawing attention from senior personnel, and NCIS is asking questions. Can you maintain position long enough to complete the primary objectives? Came the response. Sarah considered the question carefully. Her mission required access to strategic planning documents that wouldn't be available for another 2 weeks. But her increasingly visible profile at the base made discovery more likely with each passing day. Possible but risky. I may need to accelerate the timeline. Negative. The intelligence you're targeting is too valuable to rush. Maintain cover and proceed as planned. The next morning brought new complications. Sarah arrived at work to find Admiral Richardson still on the base, conducting extended meetings with senior staff. Even more concerning, she noticed Lieutenant Commander Foster in conversation with several of her colleagues, apparently expanding her investigation. Around mid-morning, Commander Williams called Sarah into his office with an unusual request. "Admiral Richardson wants you to attend this afternoon's strategic planning session," Williams said, looking puzzled. "Specifically requested you. Says he was impressed with your insights yesterday." Sarah felt a chill of concern. Strategic planning sessions were restricted to senior personnel with appropriate security clearances. Her presence would be highly unusual and would expose her to information far beyond what an administrative assistant should access. "Are you sure, Commander? That seems above my clearance level. The Admiral specifically authorized your attendance. He wants someone taking detailed notes who understands operational efficiency. Apparently, your comments about reporting procedures really caught his attention." Sarah spent the lunch hour trying to determine Admiral Richardson's motives. Was he genuinely impressed with her administrative insights? Or did he suspect something and want to test her reactions to classified information? Either way, she had no choice but to attend. The strategic planning session took place in the base's most secure conference room, equipped with sophisticated anti-surveillance technology and restricted to personnel with the highest security clearances. Sarah felt the weight of scrutiny as she entered the room carrying her notebook. Admiral Richardson acknowledged her presence with a nod before beginning a discussion of naval positioning in response to emerging global threats. The conversation covered highly classified information about ship movements, intelligence assessments, and strategic capabilities. As the session progressed, Sarah realized she was being tested. Admiral Richardson would make strategic statements and then glance in her direction as if gauging her reactions. When he discussed submarine patrol routes, he watched her face. When he mentioned intelligence-gathering priorities, his eyes searched for any sign of recognition or surprise. Sarah maintained her role perfectly, taking notes with the focused attention of someone trying to capture important information without necessarily understanding its full implications. But internally, she was analyzing every piece of intelligence being discussed, recognizing patterns and strategic implications that revealed far more about naval capabilities than she had expected to learn. During a break, Admiral Richardson approached her directly. "How are you finding the session, Ms. Chun?" "Very educational, Admiral. I'm learning a lot about how strategic decisions are made." "I imagine you are. Tell me, what's your assessment of the patrol rotation schedule we discussed?" The question was clearly a test. The patrol schedule was highly classified information, and no administrative assistant should have opinions about strategic naval deployments. Sarah chose her words very carefully. From a logistics perspective, it seems like a complex coordination challenge. Making sure all the moving pieces work together efficiently must require a lot of planning. Admiral Richardson smiled slightly. "Indeed it does. And what about the intelligence priorities we outlined?" Another test question. Sarah maintained her role while providing an answer that demonstrated analytical thinking without revealing too much expertise. It seems like balancing immediate needs with long-term planning would be the main challenge. Making sure you have the right information when you need it. "You have good instinct for this work, Ms. Chun. Have you ever considered a career in naval intelligence?" The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah felt the eyes of everyone in the room on her, waiting for her response. "I'm happy in my current role, Admiral, but I appreciate the vote of confidence." As the session concluded, Sarah knew her situation had become critical. Admiral Richardson's questions weren't casual conversation. They were the probing inquiries of someone who suspected her true identity. Her answers had been careful, but she could see the thoughtful expression on his face as he evaluated her responses. That evening, Sarah made another encrypted call to her handler. "The situation is escalating rapidly," she reported. "Admiral Richardson is conducting what amounts to a formal assessment. I think he knows. What's your confidence level in maintaining cover?" "Low and dropping. He's too experienced, and I'm being exposed to information that requires reactions I can't fake indefinitely. Hold position. We need that intelligence." But as Sarah ended the call, she knew that holding position might not be possible much longer. Admiral Richardson was closing in on her true identity, and when he finally connected all the pieces, the consequences would extend far beyond her personal mission. The next morning would bring the final test, and Sarah wasn't sure her carefully constructed cover would survive it. Sarah arrived at the naval base Wednesday morning to find an unusual level of activity. Security personnel were positioned at checkpoints that normally operated with minimal staffing, and she noticed several unfamiliar vehicles in the parking areas reserved for senior officials. At her desk, Janet greeted her with obvious concern. "Something big is happening," she whispered. Admiral Richardson extended his visit, and there are rumors about a major security review. Before Sarah could respond, Commander Williams appeared at her desk with an expression she couldn't read. "Ms. Chun, Admiral Richardson wants to see you in conference room immediately." Sarah's pulse quickened, but she maintained her calm exterior. "Did he say what it was regarding?" "No, but Lieutenant Commander Foster from NCIS will be there as well. Bring your security badge and any materials you've been working on." The walk to conference room felt longer than usual. Sarah mentally reviewed her cover story, prepared responses to likely questions, and considered various scenarios for how this meeting might unfold. But as she approached the conference room, she realized that whatever was about to happen would likely end her mission one way or another. Admiral Richardson was seated at the head of the conference table when Sarah entered, with Lieutenant Commander Foster positioned to his right. Two other officers she didn't recognize flanked the left side of the table. The formal arrangement immediately told Sarah this was an interrogation, not a meeting. "Please have a seat, Ms. Chun," Admiral Richardson said, gesturing to the chair directly across from him. Sarah sat down, placing her notebook on the table and folding her hands calmly in her lap. "How can I help you, Admiral?" Admiral Richardson studied her for a moment before speaking. "We've been conducting a comprehensive review of base security protocols, and your name has come up several times during our discussions." "I hope in a positive context," Sarah replied, maintaining eye contact. "That remains to be determined," Lieutenant Commander Foster interjected. "We have some questions about your background and your activities since arriving here." For the next 30 minutes, they systematically went through Sarah's cover story, asking for details about her previous employment, her educational background, and her reasons for seeking work at the naval base. Sarah provided consistent answers, but she could sense they were building towards something specific. "Let's talk about your performance during the security incident last week," Admiral Richardson said, consulting notes on his tablet. "Multiple witnesses observed that you handled the crisis with unusual expertise." "I try to be helpful during a difficult situation," Sarah replied. "More than helpful. You demonstrated knowledge of backup communication protocols, security procedures, and crisis management techniques that exceed what we would expect from someone with your stated background." Sarah felt the walls closing in, but she maintained her composure. "I read the orientation materials thoroughly, and I have experience working in environments where security was important." Admiral Richardson leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Chun, I've been in naval service for over 30 years. I've trained hundreds of officers and worked with thousands of personnel across every level of our organization. Your behavior patterns, your analytical instincts, and your operational knowledge don't match your claimed background." The moment Sarah had been dreading had arrived. Admiral Richardson had seen through her cover, and continuing to maintain the deception would only make the situation worse. "What exactly are you suggesting, Admiral?" she asked, buying time to consider her options. "I'm suggesting that you're not who you claim to be," Admiral Richardson said directly. "The question is who you really are and what you're doing here." Sarah sat quietly for several seconds, weighing her choices. She could continue the deception and hope to weather the investigation, but Admiral Richardson clearly had evidence she couldn't explain away. She could attempt to leave immediately, but security had certainly been increased around the base. Or she could take a calculated risk and reveal enough truth to potentially salvage her mission. "You're very perceptive, Admiral," Sarah finally said, her voice taking on a different tone, more confident more authoritative. I thought so. So who are you really? Sarah reached slowly into her wallet, maintaining eye contact with Admiral Richardson to avoid any sudden movements that might alarm security. She withdrew what appeared to be a standard driver's license and placed it on the table. Admiral Richardson picked up the license and examined it carefully. His expression shifted from suspicion to confusion to complete shock as he read the information displayed. "This can't be correct," he said, looking up at Sarah with new understanding dawning in his eyes. Lieutenant Commander Foster leaned over to see the identification, and her reaction was equally dramatic. "Admiral Chun," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Sarah nodded calmly. "Admiral Sarah Chun, Naval Intelligence Command. I apologize for the deception, but my presence here is part of a classified operation authorized at the highest levels of command." The silence in the room was profound. Admiral Richardson stared at the identification, then back at Sarah, clearly processing the implications of what he had just learned. "You're Admiral Chun," he said slowly. "The Admiral Chun who developed the Pacific Theater Intelligence Integration Protocols. The Admiral Chun who led the strategic assessment that reshaped our submarine deployment strategy." "The same," Sarah confirmed, her demeanor now completely transformed from the modest administrative assistant they had known. "Though I'd prefer if we could keep that information restricted to this room for now." Admiral Richardson set down the identification and leaned back in his chair. "This is unprecedented. What kind of operation requires a flag officer to work undercover as civilian support staff?" "The kind that tests whether our security protocols are as robust as we believe them to be," Sarah replied. "My assignment was to evaluate base security, intelligence handling procedures, and personnel awareness from the inside." Lieutenant Commander Foster found her voice. "This was a security test? We've been investigating a penetration operation conducted by our own personnel." "Not exactly a test," Sarah clarified. "More of an assessment. Recent intelligence suggests that foreign operatives have successfully infiltrated naval facilities using techniques similar to what I've employed here. My mission was to determine how easily someone with appropriate training could gain access to sensitive information and operations." Admiral Richardson processed this information with the analytical mind of a senior military strategist. "And what have you discovered?" Sarah's expression became serious. "That our security protocols have significant vulnerabilities. In less than 2 weeks, I gained access to highly classified strategic planning sessions, sensitive intelligence assessments, and operational details that could compromise fleet security if obtained by hostile actors." The implications hung in the air like a storm cloud. Everyone in the room understood that if Sarah could accomplish so much so quickly, a real enemy operative could potentially do even more damage. "How did you manage it?" Admiral Richardson asked. "The background checks, the security clearances, the access protocols. My cover identity was constructed at the highest levels of naval intelligence," Sarah explained. "The background is real, but heavily sanitized. My security clearance exists, but was deliberately downgraded for this operation. The administrative position provided exactly the access I needed while keeping me below the threshold of serious scrutiny. Until I started asking questions," Admiral Richardson said. "You were the first person to seriously challenge my cover," Sarah acknowledged. "Your experience and instincts made maintaining the deception increasingly difficult." Lieutenant Commander Foster was taking notes rapidly. "What specific vulnerabilities did you identify?" Sarah outlined her findings systematically. "First, the background check process relies too heavily on documentation that can be fabricated at sufficient levels of authority. Second, administrative positions provide extensive access to sensitive information without commensurate oversight. Third, personnel are generally trusting of colleagues who demonstrate competence and helpfulness. And fourth," Admiral Richardson prompted, sensing there was more. "The most significant vulnerability is that our security culture assumes threats come from outside. No one seriously considered that I might be something other than what I appeared because I was already inside the system." Admiral Richardson nodded grimly. "The insider threat problem. We've been so focused on preventing external penetration that we haven't adequately prepared for internal deception. Exactly. A real enemy operative using these techniques could potentially operate undetected for months while gathering intelligence that could compromise fleet operations across the entire Pacific theater. The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the implications of Sarah's assessment. Finally, Admiral Richardson spoke. Admiral Chun, what are your recommendations? Sarah had been preparing this moment throughout her entire operation. Enhanced verification procedures for all personnel regardless of apparent security level. Regular rotation of administrative staff to prevent long-term positioning. Most importantly, security awareness training that includes insider threat scenarios. Implementation timeline. Immediate for critical procedures. 6 months for comprehensive restructuring. But, Admiral, there's something else you need to know. Admiral Richardson raised an eyebrow. More vulnerabilities? My operation here wasn't just an assessment. While conducting the security evaluation, I uncovered evidence of an actual foreign intelligence operation targeting this facility. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Explain, Admiral Richardson said sharply. Sarah opened her notebook to a section filled with observations she had made during her time on the base. 3 individuals currently assigned to this facility exhibit behavior patterns consistent with intelligence collection activities. Their background stories have minor inconsistencies. Their technical knowledge exceeds their claimed experience levels, and they've been systematically accessing information outside their operational requirements. Lieutenant Commander Foster leaned forward intently. Who? Sarah provided names and detailed observations about the suspected operatives, along with documentation of their activities that she had compiled during her weeks of observation. I recommend immediate but discreet investigation of these individuals. Admiral Richardson was already reaching for his secure phone. This changes everything. Lieutenant Commander Foster, I want a full security team mobilized immediately, but with absolute discretion. If these are real foreign operatives, we can't alert them to our suspicions. As Foster left to coordinate the investigation, Admiral Richardson turned back to Sarah. Admiral Chun, I have to ask, how many other operations like yours are currently active? Sarah smiled slightly. I'm not at liberty to discuss other ongoing assessments, Admiral, but I can tell you that fleet security is receiving unprecedented attention at all levels of command. Because of the current global situation, because our adversaries have become significantly more sophisticated in their intelligence operations. The techniques I used here are based on actual enemy capabilities we've observed in other contexts. Admiral Richardson studied Sarah with new respect. I've heard about your reputation for unconventional operations, but experiencing it firsthand is remarkable. You completely fooled everyone here, including me, until I started looking closely. The best cover is one that allows you to be genuinely helpful, Sarah replied. I wasn't pretending to be competent. I was using my actual skills while concealing their full extent. And now I'll need to transition back to my official role while the real investigation proceeds. My cover is blown, but that might actually be advantageous for the next phase of operations. Over the following hours, the base transformed as Admiral Richardson's security teams discreetly began investigating the suspected foreign operatives. Sarah worked closely with the investigation team, providing detailed intelligence about the suspects' activities and helping to coordinate a comprehensive counterintelligence operation. By evening, 2 of the 3 suspected operatives had been quietly taken into custody, while the third had apparently recognized the increased security activity and attempted to leave the base. He was apprehended at the main gate with classified documents in his possession. As Sarah prepared her final report in Admiral Richardson's office, she reflected on the unexpected turn her mission had taken. What began as a security assessment had uncovered an actual espionage operation, potentially preventing significant damage to fleet security. Admiral Chin, Admiral Richardson said as she concluded her documentation, I want you to know that your operation here has been invaluable, not just for identifying our vulnerabilities, but for stopping a real threat. Sarah nodded, satisfied with the outcome. The security improvements we discussed will be critical going forward. Our adversaries are becoming more sophisticated, and we need to stay ahead of their capabilities. Agreed. And, Admiral, next time you conduct one of these assessments, perhaps a bit more advance warning to the local commander would be appropriate. Sarah smiled. That would defeat the purpose of testing whether you could identify the threat on your own, which I'm pleased to report you did. As Sarah finally revealed her true identity to the personnel who had worked with her, their reactions ranged from shock to admiration to embarrassment at how completely they had been deceived. But her colleagues also understood that her presence had ultimately made their facility more secure and their operations more effective. The modest administrative assistant who had arrived 2 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by the accomplished naval officer she had always been. But the mission had succeeded beyond all expectations, proving both the vulnerabilities in their security systems and the dedication of the personnel who worked to protect them.